Hello everyone, and in this particular topic we are going to discuss about ventricular pressure volume loops. When we want to understand the pumping mechanics of the heart, one of the most informative tools we use is the ventricular pressure volume loop. This particular diagram captures a single closed curve, the relationship between the pressure inside the ventricle and its volume of blood during one complete cardiac cycle. It's like a signature of how the ventricle fills, contracts, ejects, and relaxes. So, according to this particular diagram, we can see, or we can say a loop, we take phase 1, which is the ventricular filling phase, which represents point A to B to C. So, the loop begins at point A when the mitral valve opens. This happens after ventricular pressure falls below the left atrial pressure at the end of isovolumetric relaxation. At this stage, the ventricle is in diastole and the blood flows in from the left atrium. So, what is A to B? Initially, as the filling begins, the pressure actually drops slightly, and this is due to the final relaxation of the ventricular muscle even as the blood enters. And if you see from B to C, the ventricle is highly compliant over here, meaning it can accept the large amount of blood without a big rise in the pressure, and this gradual volume increase with only a mild pressure rise represents the passive filling phase, that is the preload. So by the time we reach the point C, the ventricle is at its highest filling point, that is the end diastolic volume, the maximum amount of the blood it will hold at the point that is in the cardiac cycle. Now this is the end of phase 1. Now we are talking about the beginning of phase 2, which is the isovolumetric contraction phase, which is point C to point D. At point C, what happens is the mitral valve closes. This marks the starting of the isovolumetric contraction, which is the first part of the systolic period of the cardiac cycle. And the volume stays constant during this period because both the mitral valve and the aortic valve are closed, and the ventricular muscle fibers contract sharply, increasing the greater pressure without ejecting any blood during this period. So this is the most energy demanding phase of the cardiac cycle because the heart is generating highest tension while the volume doesn't change. So the pressure continues to build until it slightly exceeds the diastolic aortic pressure, which brings us the point D, right? Now we are at the point D. We are going to discuss about the phase 3, which is the ejection. That is point D to point E to point F. We will discuss one by one in detail. At point D, the aortic valve opens and the ventricular ejection begins as the aortic valve opens. So what is D to E? D to E is the rapid ejection phase where most of the stroke volume leaves the ventricle early, causing the rapid drop in the ventricular volume while the pressure rises to its peak, the ventricular systolic pressure, which also corresponds to the systolic blood pressure in the aorta. From E to F, this is called as the reduced ejection phase. So here the ventricular pressure falls as the contraction wanes, but the blood still leaves the ventricle because the pressure is still higher when compared to that of the aorta. So by the time we reach the point F, the ventricle has ejected the stroke volume completely and now containing the end-systolic volume, the volume which remains in the ventricle after the contraction is completed, the lowest volume in the cycle when we say about the left ventricle especially. Now we discuss about the phase 4, which is the isovolumetric relaxation phase. Here I am going to discuss about the point F. At point F, the aortic valve closes, producing a dicrotic notch in the aortic pressure trace. This marks the onset of isovolumetric relaxation. The ventricle relaxes, pressure falls sharply, but the volume remains constant because both the valves are closed. when ventricular pressure drops below the atrial pressure, the mitral valve opens and we are at the back of point A and ready for the start of next cycle. This is about the pressure volume loop of the cardiac cycle, and this is how you can understand all the mechanical events, what is happening in the cardiac cycle, which can be represented with the famous loop. Now I want to give you a small clinical insights before I close this particular topic. What happens when there is an increase in the preload or afterload? Increase in the preload means more filling, which shifts the loop towards the right with a higher end-diastolic volume and greater the stroke volume. And in the same case, when there is an increased afterload, example, when there is a hypertension, when there is a lot of systemic vascular resistance, makes the loop taller and narrower because higher pressure but less ejection will be there. This is how you can correlate with the clinical conditions with this ventricular pressure volume loops.